So thank you, Emily. Let me start off by just kind of laying out the agenda here. I want to talk a little bit about why MovieLabs is here. We've been kind of at the periphery of the ASWF for a while, but we really have a strong belief in open source and its value, so we're glad to be engaging more. Talk a little bit about the workflow that we did a little POC in our little internal sandbox. Then Tom will talk a little bit about OpenAssetIO and why we used it, why it fit in well with some of the MovieLabs 2030 vision aspects. Talk a little bit about security, because security is changing and it's hard, and then a little bit about kind of what's up next. So why is MovieLabs here? So we're a technology joint venture of 5 major Hollywood studios: Paramount, Sony, Universal, Disney, and WBD. And we've been around for a while. We've worked in a number of different areas. We helped get HDR video into the international standards bodies. We did a bunch of work on identifiers, the Entertainment Identifier Registry. A lot of that work was focused on distribution, but for the last 5 years, our focus has been almost entirely on production technology instead. So we generally work to try and get the studios to align and agree on where they want the technology roadmaps to go in areas that are not competitive between them. And then we try and help move the industry in those directions. About 4 years ago, we published something called the Evolution of Media Creation, more commonly known as the 2030 Vision, that kind of laid out where our member studios wanted to see production technology moving over then a 10-year time frame. In particular, as production moves to the cloud, as we start seeing more use of real-time iteration and game engines, as we see workflows across the entire pre-production through finishing being better supported by software, what we call kind of software-defined workflows, and also security, because we think security needs to have a new model. So check out the white paper, it's good. I wanted to just lay out 4 areas which are why we did this POC using some of these projects. One of them is, one of the key concepts of the 2030 vision is that we're no longer copying assets all over the place, within a department, between studios and vendors. The idea is that the assets should go straight to the cloud, they should stay there, the applications should come to the assets, not vice versa. And a side effect of that is that when I do propagate assets, either, say, within a department, a production, cross departments to vendors, that publication can be just a publish function where there's a permissions change and a message notification saying, hey, you can go now over to this S3 bucket and get your stuff. So, we think that that's kind of a paradigm change. The security aspects of the cloud, I think, are very different than traditional perimeter security. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. We also are strong believers in kind of separating out asset location and file names from metadata and actually referencing assets by identifiers as opposed to by their locations, which can change, and there may be multiple of those. Also, linking those assets is very important. And so linkage by metadata, relationships between all of these assets. We've worked on something called the MovieLabs ontology for media creation that tries to do some of that. We're starting to do a CG asset extension to that. And some of this fits in, I think, quite well with the OpenAssetIO model of traits, which are some of those metadata items that if you need to find the right stuff, you need to understand some of those attributes and relationships. Last of all, we think that software is very important, that we really want to automate all of the mundane, repetitive tasks between things. And to do that, it's really helpful to have interoperable standards, whether it's for file formats like OpenEXR and now OTIO, whether it's for APIs and interfaces, which a lot of the software packages provide. Especially if you want to make those workflows recomposable, you want to change your pipeline around, you want to replace one tool or service with something from a different tool provider. We want to really make those workflows less brittle and make it easier to recompose them. Because currently, building a pipeline is a very, very expensive, and the automation around it is a very expensive proposition, and it's also very brittle, or at least from some of we've heard from some of our studios, is that it's very difficult to replace tools without having your software engineers ready to go in and fix things. So we're strong believers for that reason in open source. And in particular, we think that the VFX and animation communities have really historically led in that area beyond other parts of the workflow from pre-production or finishing that may have been a little bit more manual, and they didn't have the scale that really required software automation. But we think that it plays a huge role. So big advocates of open source software. We have this ontology. You see some shapes up there. You'll see some of those in some of the diagrams, in some of the subsequent slides. As I mentioned, we're currently doing a CG assets extension, but the reason we're talking about ontology as opposed to taxonomies is that it's the relationships. It's actually being able to connect all of these things, being able to connect things back to character, back to script, back to set and location. That we see as missing in some other metadata models. So hey, check it out. There's QR code up there. Talk a little bit about, I think, the workflow that we decided to prototype to demonstrate some of this. We have a little sandbox, and I don't know, Chris, maybe you can just kind of talk a little bit about our sandbox.
Yeah, so what we wanted to do is go from principles to practice. So you have these these 10 great principles, but you really want to kind of bring them into the real world. And MovieLabs isn't writing all this brand new software, so we have to go in and take all the existing tools and all the open source and be able to compose some of these new workflows. So what we did is we created some fake entities. So we have MovieLabs Studio, a fake production company called LabCoat Media, and then we have a VFX vendor. Those three organizations have worked together to produce a short called Hyperspace Madness. For those of you that know me, this is something that we did at Autodesk, and thank you to Autodesk for letting us use this. But we basically built this model so that we could have three different organizations work together on this simple example, which is a VFX turnover. So before we go to the newer model, we want to talk about the current way of working. So current way of working is I'm working locally. I work with the director. I get a new version. That new version is rendered locally. And then you have a whole variety of review tools today, Moxion, Frame.io. There's a copy that's made. That copy's made to the SaaS service, so there's a second version that's there. I can review that, but in most of the VFX review current workflows, there's another copy that's made. And so basically what I get into this workflow is I'm able to do modern review and have different collaborators, but I'm stuck with multiple copies of the material. And then once that final copy is done to the desktop, it's basically there's no security left. So at that point, it's up to the individual to clean things up. And also all these copies that are left, there's no process at the end to clean them up. So you have multiple copies of your media, and it's not as secure as what we want to propose in the 2030 vision.
Yeah, I think one of the things here, in a lot of traditional workflows, the security is a side effect of the fact that I copied it. I copied it from one department server to another department server. I copied it from the editor's work area over to the VFX company. And so in this model, we really want to get we want to stop copying and we want to start publishing. So Chris, I guess the 2030 vision of the workflow.
Yeah, so in this model, again, you're not changing the task. This is not some new paradigm of working. There's still, you have to work with your creatives. You get a new version. And instead of rendering out the local version and then moving it, the media is immediately rendered to shared cloud storage. Then that process of saying I want to share with collaborators, in this case the VFX house, is actually just a process of granting permission to have access to that. Then when I do the VFX review, I'm doing that hopefully in open source software, and that open source software will have had the identifier that was created as part of that process embedded in the timelines, so that when I review, it goes and resolves where the media is, will show how that's done securely, and then the media is just streamed locally on a short-term basis while the policy allows it, and then I do the same review, and you'll see in the video, none of the user sees changes, but we actually now have the media doesn't move. Publishing is done as an operation, and it's done in a secure manner.
And so I think the first step in this workflow is on the editor side, and here we have the shared cloud storage. We used a distributed file system called Iconic, which is backed by S3 as part of that. And that really is the source of truth for all of this. We do acknowledge that you're going to have locally cached working copies for performance and other reasons, but the important part of having the shared cloud storage is really that the source of truth kind of remains in the cloud. And so, Chris?
Yeah, so here you just see, again, we're in Adobe Premiere, and the difference is what you're seeing is a framework, and an automation framework called Helman Effects. And what that's doing is that's ensuring that I have the right naming convention. It's ensuring that the files are rendered to the right location, and it also provides the automation framework so that the media is brought to the right place, and then it notifies the iconic webhook to start the next part of the process, which would be the publish.
Yeah. And so here's what Chris just described, the clicking on the publish to production in Helman FX, which then triggered that bit of automation. And after that, there's another bit of automation that happens kind of in our middle box, which is the kind of publication to the other collaborators within the production. And so that, as Chris mentioned, is triggered by, in this case, a webhook hanging off of Iconic. Basically, each of the original clip MOVs is transcoded into a streamable MP4 and stored in S3. We then generate an OTIO from the FCP XML. That also is put up into S3. And then all of those assets are then registered with our resolver so that we can refer to them by identifier instead of by location. It also changes the access control permissions on those assets to ensure that the appropriate people within the production have access to them. And then we have this little production portal that we kind of keep track of tasks in, and it now registers a task, I think, for the director to review and authorize the publication to VFX.
It's not a little portal. It was a lot of work to build. But yeah, so basically at this point, you go in and we've created a simple workflow. Again, in the future, this will be done in other production management tools. And then we want to be able to publish to VFX. Instead of, again, the process of notifying someone or doing editorial turnover with email, this is a process where once as the director, once I've decided that I want my VFX house to see that, it's a matter of just hitting a simple publish button, which changes the access permissions.
And we also have the ability to revoke. So you can, if you change your mind, you can undo what you just did. So this is what we just saw with the publication to VFX. So now it goes over to the VFX house, and
so again, one of the things we did, again going back to the open source, is we added a login, an ability to authenticate in OpenRV, and we'll thank people at the end. But we want to talk about that zero trust model where we were able to two-factor authentication into RV so that we have an authenticated user, and here being able to say that we know that this is the VFX, the Vitali user that's logging into OpenRV. You see here, I have no tasks. I've refreshed, and this is again in sync with the other video, which then you see that I have, when I refresh, I get the tasks that are there. Once I hit review, so again, as the VFX artist, I hit the review button, and that review will, with my access permissions, go in, load the OTIO for every clip, and see if I have permissions, stream it down, and then what I'm seeing here in OpenRV is that timeline that was published out of Premiere, and instead of it being a local copy, it's loading the OTIO and streaming each of the clips individually.
And Chris managed to finish it before his battery ended the video recording.
Again, one of the interesting stories of open source was that this was done by Matt Daw, I'm sure many of you know here, and he did it on the Mac. And since the only Mac that I have in my house is my daughter's laptop, I'd like to thank my daughter for giving her laptop, and the low battery is her fault. I'll blame it totally on her.
And how many times did it take you to actually pass the CAPTCHA?
That's another story. That was cut out of the clip for timing, yeah.
Anyway, so what we just saw, kind of under the covers, maybe Tom, you can take over from here on OpenAssetIO as to how things worked inside of OpenRV.
Yeah, sure. So OpenAssetIO functions as an asset resolver in the space, similar to one you may find in USD. And it's particularly critical here because the OTIO file doesn't have file paths in. It has these identifiers that point to the specific asset that we need to load for each clip. And because we now have an authenticated user in the application, it means we can check at that point in time, should this user be able to see this footage? But also, when we resolve this before we access it, you can get the best location to access that media. Maybe you're off-site somewhere. There might be a faster location for you to load this from versus perhaps if you're in the screening room or in a facility with a bigger connection. So it's really that link between moving away from file-based referencing in these documents. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment.
Yeah. So just to kind of summarize, this is what we were showing. This, 2 publication events, one within the production, two publication events, one within the production, one off to VFX, and working from these shared cloud resources. And I think with that, we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into OpenAssetIO.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. OpenAssetIO is something that we've been working on as part of the ASWF for the last couple of years. And what is it? It's an open standard that helps to try and connect tools that create content to the systems that we all have to manage that data as part of a collaborative workflow with lots of people. So in this case, you can see your tool hosts OpenAssetIO, and through loading a specific plugin, you can connect it to whatever production tracking data management system you have. So in this case, it's connected to the MovieLabs resolver that you saw in the previous diagrams. And why are we doing this? Like, writing pipelines is hard. Writing stable, robust pipelines is really difficult, kind of because of the situation we have here. Every specific tool has its own API for automating actions. And so as a pipeline developer, you have to rewrite the same glue code time and time again against all of these different APIs. And we think we can make a better world for people so that we can spend more time actually building innovative workflows for artists to get them to work more effectively. And the way we've done this is we've kind of split it into 2 components. And this was where we kind of had this double alignment with the vision that we talked about earlier, which was the core library itself is really about establishing the verbs around creating assets, learning about which ones exist, and querying data. And then the second part of this, and this is where it gets a lot more contentious, is what types of things do we have? How do we describe them? What is the critical metadata we need about these assets to ensure it's loaded correctly? So we've kind of split this up to help facilitate a stable core surface developers can use whilst we sort of refine these topics. And this is the overlap with the ontology work that Jim mentioned at the beginning. We need a shared understanding of what these are, which is what creates our ability to have interop. And so for the more technical view here, the way we kind of do this is we call these identifiers in OpenAssetIO world an entity reference. And the key thing here is we're not trying to tell you how to design your pipeline. These references are owned by the pipeline itself, and the host just uses them as a handle to latch on to any specific asset. So there's some examples here. And at the bottom, there's a little a snippet of some OpenAssetIO code, which is querying 3 of the traits we have in the sort of the media creation space to learn more about how to properly load this EXR sequence. So you can see we've got a frame range and a color space. So things that can be quite fragile to reverse engineer by looking on a file system or something like that. And if you're loading data from the cloud, there is no file system to go and have a look at how many frames there are for this asset. So a bit of a plug here, like the vision here is really about trying to build first-class asset-centric workflows into tools to reduce the integration effort for everyone trying to use this huge ecosystem of products to build a workflow. And we really hope artists just have a better experience at the end of this. So there's a glimpse of the future potentially on the right-hand side here where a timeline application is able to consult with your source of truth to work out, hey, this new edit that I just got given, how does it differ from what everyone in the company is working with at this point in time? So we're currently sort of heading into the beta phase, so we're really pushing to do projects like this where we can help validate the concept. And what's been great about this is doing it against some of the more modern security considerations, and it kind of just fit in quite well. So we've got our bit of a feather tomorrow morning if anyone wants to talk assets at 9 on a Monday. Come and say hello. We will make it fun and exciting, I promise. But yeah, give us a shout if you want to learn more.
And it was a great experience working with Tom and the team, and we really quickly built this library in. So for everyone that wants to give it a shot, it's really an easy thing to integrate into the tools that you're using.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. That was great. So I want to talk a little bit now about security. And so back to kind of the 2030 vision aspects of it. Traditionally, a lot of production security has been done on perimeters, traditionally physical perimeters, and where's the tape kept, more recently network perimeters. And those kind of work if you have local infrastructure, and even if you do hybrid cloud, you can extend your network perimeter out to include that hybrid cloud. But it doesn't work, we don't think, when you actually move to real cloud-based workflows, especially with multiple parties and participants coming to use those assets. So in our 2030 vision, the cloud is a global production resource, and it's used by multiple facilities, and often even groups that don't have any infrastructure. And the workflows are running there in the cloud, and ideally in our model, the applications are coming to the assets in that model. So it's happening outside of all of these traditional perimeters. We also have in this new world a lot of individuals coming in, freelancers, maybe infrastructuralist post houses that will also be leveraging some of this cloud infrastructure. And so the perimeter model just really doesn't work there anymore. And so we think there's a need to move to a zero trust model. It's a security approach that's being used very widely in enterprise because it prevents breaches from spreading. You don't have the hard shell and the soft marshmallow in the inside. And once someone pokes a hole in the outside, they have access to everything. And the viruses can easily spread laterally. You can jump from file server to file server and pull out assets. Whereas if you had multiple authentication authorization checks within that would not happen. And so we think that model applies here as well. And it basically is about authentication. Basically, every time someone or some service does something, it should authenticate itself to that other endpoint before that endpoint lets it do something. And authorizations should be checked. So if I have more complicated authorization policies than just you can do anything on this service, maybe you can only access certain parts of the database, only certain assets, that those authorizations are checked against the participant who's trying to do those things. Devices ideally should also be authenticated. Make sure that it actually is Chris's laptop that's connecting to Okta while he tries repeatedly to log in, as opposed to maybe some bad actor's laptop that's trying to get in. It also applies between services. And this gets a little complicated because when services are acting on behalf of users, you may want to use the user's authentication for that, but often you need persistent service level capabilities and credentials. And so sometimes some of those can be managed like within a service mesh type implementation where everything within it is very well trusted and regulated, but there are also other mechanisms. But anyway, basically it's complicated. We developed a common security architecture for production that we think provides one approach to doing this. You'll notice, I'm not going to get into it here, but at least some of those little icons, you see authentication, little fingerprint, authorization, little check mark, and these little gateways that are policy enforcement points, which I'll show you a little bit of what it looks like in the POC that we did. You have lots of places where users need to authenticate before they're allowed to do stuff, whether it's logging into the PremierePro workstation, the OpenRV login, et cetera. Also, logging into things like our production portal. We did a lot of that through Okta, but it was unfortunate that Chris actually had to do 2 authentications. There should not have been 2.
Well, I did it on Google. I was on Google on my laptop.
Okay. Well, we should federate with Google so that it all works. Anyway, there also are service authentications where a service may need to have a credential that allows it to authenticate to another service. There are places where we did a lot of policy changes where certain of the services needed to go in and change authorization policies in some of the other services, or in storage, or in the resolver. And then the place where you have the most pervasive need is actually on checking those authorizations and verifying the authentication that's handed to you in a token. And so basically every time that there's an access to a service or a new transaction on a service that may have different authorization requirements, you need to check. And so, all in all, there are, I think, close to 20 different, security touch points in what really is a fairly simple POC. And it's for that reason that we think that it's important for there to be some work in the ASWF that can help provide some of the best practices and perhaps maybe even some source code that can help some ASWF projects that need to function either as pass-throughs of authorization or need to be able to authenticate to another service or perhaps acting as a service to authenticate the client. So lots more to come on security. By way of summary, what did we learn in the POC? Well, I think those 4 things that I outlined early on as our 2030 demonstration goals, I think we did that. We worked from common storage and allowed publishing in place. We had pervasive authentication and authorization checks, which our developers spent a lot of time implementing. We were able to use identifiers instead of locations and show the use of an asset resolution service and OpenAssetIO to do that. And we also, I think, showed improved interoperability with open source and the type of thing that things like OTIO can do and OpenAssetIO when they're integrated or integratable into things like OpenRV. OpenAssetIO, we were interested in it because it lined up very well with the MovieLabs vision of getting away from using file locations and file paths for all the references. It did that. It worked. It was fit for purpose. It was easy to work. We didn't find like hordes of bugs or anything. OpenTimelineIO was, I think, the same. It did what it was advertised to do, and it did it well. It worked as a vendor-independent conveyance for timelines and associated metadata. It was great that OpenRV already had OTIO integrated with it, so we didn't have to do that. And also the fact that OpenRV was open source, it actually allowed us to make a few little changes that we needed in order to propagate some of the authentication information through to our MovieLabs resolution plugin that needed to authenticate to our resolver service. So it was a great project, we think. The last item, which I mentioned, I think we need to do more work on, is security and looking for interested participants from the ASWF to help us make it easier for projects to move into this new world where you can't always rely on a perimeter. So more open source software for that would be great. So anyway, what's up next? I mentioned making security easier. We're proposing a security working group. There's a Slack. If you want to join it, contribute to the discussion. If you're interested in participating in the formation and the definition of the charter, drop me an email. Try out OpenAssetIO. It's great. We love it. There's a Slack there and a Git repo. And if you want to work on this traits model or more information on that, reach out to Tom. And on the MovieLabs side, check out the MovieLabs ontology for media creation. We do have a JSON set of bindings for it that are currently in preview. We can give you access to the GitHub for that. There also is a CG Assets drafting group that's starting up that we'd love to get some more participation in from the industry. Visual language, you can reach out to Chris. Common Security Architecture for Production, Spencer. We also have an upcoming white paper on interoperability as kind of a set of principles and asks to the software, SaaS, and DCC tool providers on what we would like to see to make it easier to integrate their offerings into workflows and pipelines that are more easily reconfigurable. If you have any interest in that, drop me an email. And with that, Chris, you want to do the thanks?
Sure. So again, it was a great, again, I think that, Doug, you had the word community again, going back and, hadn't been working in the community for a year or so, but again, to come back and see that everyone is working really well. So thank you to the OpenRV and Autodesk, so Alain, Roger, and Guillaume. Adobe, again, they were, they don't have yet the OTIO, but they were great and giving us all the workarounds. So thanks to Bill, Josh Miner. I don't know if Josh is here, but again, thank you so much for giving us some guidelines there. We used this framework Helmet, and Raphael was great, and Tom and David and Elliot were really great in helping us with that, and thank you to the ASWF for all the opportunity to do that.
And God willing, we'll have more open source software coming soon.